Welcome to Zero Shot Espresso, the show for AI engineers who are tired of building data pipelines. In this podcast, we talk to engineers and founders about deep systems engineering and the messy reality of data in the age of AI. My name is Jay, your host for the show. I'm co-founder of Daft, and we are building data systems to power AI products. So today I'm really excited to have Animesh. Thank you, Animesh, for hopping on the pod. Animesh is founder and CEO of PlayerZero, the AI platform that predicts code failures before they happen, right? Animesh started PlayerZero while at Stanford, studying under founders of leading data and AI companies such as Databricks and Sisu Data. And, personally, I work on Daft, and we often compare ourselves to Spark. And, Animesh worked under Mate, who was kind of the first person who really built Spark. And welcome to the podcast, Animesh.
Thank you, Jay. Excited to be here.
Yeah. You want to maybe give everyone a quick run through of, what you're working on and how you came to work on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So at PlayerZero, we're building an AI production engineering platform. What that really means is we think about what it takes to actually maintain and operate software after it's left the IDE. There's been a ton of focus over the course of these last, call it 2-3 years on how do we write code faster. But I think the question within the question is, what happens next? How do we make sure that, the code stays alive? How do we support it for our customers? And what do we do when it breaks? And to your other question, how did we actually end up working on this problem? I think with a lot of founding stories, it often, connects back to something personal. For me, it was, I just basically grew up doing support and QA for my dad. And so my dad is a CTO of a company that he started when I was in 4th or 5th grade. And the first couple of years, it was just two guys in a basement. And I spent the first, 4 or 5 years of that startup actually just being free labor. So I used to do the QA, I used to do the support. The first phone I ever got was actually answering phone calls, answering support calls to the company. And then I watched my dad grow it. So after that, it grew to almost 50 or 60 engineers and almost 200 or so employees.
Really cool.
So yeah, that's basically spent most of my life growing up supporting and operating software. And so, I think when we started seeing this world where AI was going to write more and more, there was this natural question of not everybody really understands it. And the way that we're going to have to support this is now going to have to look very, very different.
Yeah. Did you start on PlayerZero before or after ChatGPT? Was there kind of a moment in which you were like, this actually needs to exist because of, the ChatGPT moment?
Yeah, so we started it actually well before ChatGPT, but we had a little bit of a cheat code. So actually, when I was in Mate's lab, I was working on model compression. And so the high level kind of idea behind this is how do you take big neural networks, compress them to become smaller, so that way inference becomes cheaper. And this was kind of riding on this trend that we were noticing that deep neural networks were getting just exponentially larger. Yeah. And if you throw more data at bigger neural networks, right, you would just be able to learn more and kind of interesting sort of priors. At the time, this was 2019, 2020 time, there weren't a lot of big neural networks out there. And so we were a hammer looking for a nail. We didn't really know where to go. And OpenAI at this time, it just trained GPT-2.
Right.
And so kind of got exposed, from an outside in. I didn't work at OpenAI or anything, but outside in, basically, got to see kind of what was happening there really early. And, when you saw GPT-2 for the first time coherently writing things, there was a variant of GPT-2 called Codex that would actually, do autocomplete. And I think GitHub Copilot was later built on top of that specific model. That was magical, dude. That was the first
I almost feel like there's a little bit of an in crowd. People that knew about this stuff. GPT was the thing, right? Everybody was telling me hey, this stuff is coming. This stuff is coming.
Yeah.
There was in crowd. Yeah.
Yeah. You could feel it was coming. It's just it was really hard to put a finger on when.
Yeah.
Exponentials are really hard to internalize and
100%. And even the experts, I remember talking to NLP experts, right? Yeah. And they told me, no, not possible. I spent, years working on this at Stanford. And then all of a sudden, just Transformers just completely changed the game.
Yeah. Exactly. No, we slept on for a little while, right? I mean, that the attention paper, I think, came out in 2016, but you actually really needed flash attention. You needed better inference. You needed better pre-training. It was, a lot of things needed to exponentially get better, but whether it was going to be 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years was unclear.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess it was almost this crashing of your passion for testing software and building good software, and then kind of the AI is actually getting really, really good. And yeah, maybe tell me a little bit more about PlayerZero itself. What do you all do? I think you already talked a little bit about that, but then interestingly, maybe more interestingly for the audience, how do you do it? What's like the really the novel approach here that enables you to do what you do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I think our view of the world is a little bit unique. And I think when I say it out loud, it doesn't sound as contrarian at the other. I'd be curious on your thoughts on the other side of this. So basically, our view of the world is like, we have all of these different functions that actually operate production software. On one side, right, you have SRE, you have support engineers, you have QA, you have security, right? All of these people who actually think about the interaction between the software that we write and the customers on the other side. And all of these different functions are different groups of people because they're different skill sets, right? They're constrained by the skill sets that we can actually hire. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is in their minds, they're actually building one kind of unsynchronized view of how the production system actually works. So in order to do great SRE work, right, you need to understand how the infrastructure and the code actually operate. And how they interact, right, with one another. If in order to be a great support engineer, you need to understand infrastructure, code, the customer ticket, state, like these kinds of things. In order to understand QA, you kind of have to do the same thing, right? In order to be a great QA, you need to understand how the code is actually going to, affect infrastructure or affect the customer states in the future. And so the view of the world that we have at PlayerZero is that, for a long time, we basically had these disorganized views of how production software works. We think with AI, there's now an opportunity to centralize this understanding. Right.
That makes sense.
If we can centralize an understanding of how production software actually works, then we can own all the work that happens on top of it.
That makes sense.
That's kind of the central thesis of PlayerZero. And that's kind of why we call ourselves a production engineering platform. I think as we actually centralize all this context, the functions, these distinct functions are actually going to start merging together, right? Yeah. The line between SRE and support actually blends really closely together. Right?
Yeah. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, what are the usual silos you see? Like, what are the big pieces? I'm assuming there's, the code itself is one big source of context, right? Maybe logs is another big source. Yep. Maybe like meeting notes or design docs. How do you, what does an engineering, if you dissect an engineering organization, right? What does it look like on the inside, usually from PlayerZero perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's like three important systems of record that we usually integrate with. Like one is your code base, the second is your ticketing system, and the third is your observability and kind of runtime telemetry system. At the end of the day, what we're trying to construct is basically some relationship between the theory of how the software is supposed to work, and then after that, kind of like the runtime execution reality. And runtime execution reality is defined by the states that are actually happening in production. So this might be logs, errors, traces, metrics, like that kind of stuff. And then after that, sometimes even defined by what customers are telling you is going wrong. Right? If I say, I was trying to upload this invoice and it didn't work, and it was an 8 GB file that I was trying to upload, right? Like it's telling you a little bit about like under which condition and which state does the system actually break. And so what we're trying to do here is actually like create a shared representation of how all of these different things actually relate to one another. And more importantly, actually do it in a way that compounds and learns over time. I think like one of the big things with agents, and I'm actually curious on your thoughts here too, like I think like a lot of last year was people basically expecting agents to be drop-in replacements for humans.
Yeah.
And like that just fundamentally isn't true. And it's the same state, like the reason it's not true is the same reason it's not true for humans. Right? I can't just like hire someone, like stick them in a new function, like to be productive like day one. I have to give them context and I need to show them how like different pieces of context actually relate in the scope and kind of problem-directed view of the work that the specific person is going to be doing. And so I think there's like a similar analogy here to agents, which is, as they're actually doing work and they're in the kind of critical like decision path of, owning important work in any enterprise, there needs to be a way for them to actually get feedback to, right, or get feedback from the trajectories, right, that they're exploring through all the pieces of context of that enterprise.
100%. No, I completely agree that it's like turning out to be a context problem. And, obviously the word context for now is like super buzzy, right? Yeah. But it really is the case if, assuming, and I do think that models are intelligent enough at this point, they're like good enough. Really, the thing that we all need to be working on is getting these agents to, number one, like use the tools more effectively, And number two, actually giving them access to the tools that matter, right? And, today, I think that the way that we treat these agents is as if they have access to everything. But I've actually started using this analogy, and, I'm curious if this resonates, of almost like hiring an external contractor, right? When I bring in a product like PlayerZero, I treat it like an external contractor, right? It shouldn't have access to everything. I really do need to scope it and like give it all the data and context that it needs to do its job really, really effectively, but also make sure that it doesn't have access to my HR records and my, my CRM and all that. Right. And so I think when people kind of treated agents as like a human, they kind of don't really understand that like there's a lot of things that humans do on a regular basis that the agents don't do today. Like agents aren't really able to like ask, I don't know, the founder for permission to like do something, right? Like it's locked in, and sometimes it's just not given the tools that it needs to go do its job.
I think there's a lot of different threads to actually pull on from this. I mean, like, I think one interesting direction is security, right? Especially as you start deploying these agents and you're trying to scope access. I think there's a very interesting, partially philosophical, and then more importantly, a practical debate of are these agents separate identities in an enterprise, or do they inherit the identity of the person that they're trying to help? And so I think there's a very interesting conversation there. And I think it's actually like tied at the hip with, what type of context can these agents actually have? I think a different direction to actually take this also would be kind of thinking about like how agents, as they exercise more agency, will actually navigate the organization to pull in context that may not actually be immediately accessible to it. And I think there's a really interesting thing that I actually heard from a customer of ours like I guess almost a week ago. It was like the first time I used PlayerZero was the first time that I felt like a tool to the agent. And I was like, wait, like, what does that even mean? And like, actually what had happened was like PlayerZero had responded to a support ticket that was escalated in Jira. It started doing the root cause, like all these different things. And then it realized that this particular engineer was actually in the critical path of actually solving that problem. And this engineer is like usually the one who messes around with that area of the architecture. They're kind of the de facto owner. And so before it actually promoted the fix, it went and pinged the engineer. And so the engineer got like a Slack message and was like, "Yo, like, here's the fix. Could you take a look at this and then run these two commands to like just verify that like this fix is actually going to work, and tell me what comes back on the other side?" And he did it. And then he completely forgot about it. And the agent from that moment forward basically, had already come up with the prescription, took it forward, like actually like remediated the fix, like pushed it all the way forward. And this engineer was like, I felt like a tool to this agent.
But that's really cool, right? That's like critical path of context gathering. The agent literally went out and gathered context.
Yeah, exactly. And it like literally went to a human because it was like, that's my only way of like actually getting the context that I need. And so, I think there's like these two different interesting threads of like, what is the UX of these agents? So that way, as they start exercising more agency, how do they navigate people and process in an organization just as much as they do like the context? But let's start on the security side. I think this is actually like a very interesting can of worms.
I mean, let's start with that. I guess like boiling that down really is number one, data access, and then number two, really the ability to almost like feedback into some sort of system. We can talk about context graphs in a bit, right? And really dig into what that means, but feedback into some sort of system that then is able to power better agents after the nth iteration, right? On the data access portion, maybe one easy way to start here, curious to get your thoughts, is MCP enough? You're obviously probably a big user of MCP in order to make PlayerZero work. I'm curious to get your thoughts. Is MCP and essentially just API access for these agents with all the stuff that comes with it, right? OAuth and all the usual, auth mechanisms that come with it. Is that enough for agents, or is the way that AI works today significantly and sufficiently different from the old world of, say, web apps, that maybe there needs to be something more to really help this governance story of like data access for agents?
Yeah, so I think a lot of our kind of first-party integrations actually are things that we've built directly on top of the API layer. And this was like a deliberate choice because the governance around those are much more easily managed for as long as like MCP is like a nascent and like immature sort of protocol, right? So this was like an important decision. And I think like, especially as we work with more regulated sort of enterprises, larger kind of mid-market companies, making sure that we had a really clear governance model of like how identity actually cascades as this agent actually does more work and as it interacts with different types of people. It was really important that we actually had had a good answer to that. I think MCP represents something interesting. Like it's not I don't know if I have a position as to like whether it's like good or bad or whether it's enough or not. I think it's a useful primitive because it allows us to like connect to like arbitrary services. So you can have any agent talk to any sort of tool set, and I now have a language, right, for agents to actually interact with and then explore all of these kind of external services. So it's not bad. I mean, we have a feature where you can actually point PlayerZero to like a arbitrary kind of MCP server. But this is often, I think, reserved for custom data sources that I don't have, right?
Gotcha.
Go to but database or go talk to this particular piece of infrastructure that is just super custom to our particular way of working.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very useful primitive, but it does not handle the governance piece at all. I think actually like what ends up coming up, right, is in order to actually create a context graph, or in order to actually create a central representation of how all of these different records of different types all interact with one another in the context of a particular decision. In order to do this really well, you actually need to think about this graph as spanning across multiple individuals across the entire organization. And I think that the governance question basically comes from the agents are usually in service of a person, right? They're usually in service of somebody at the organization or a customer or something like that. And what needs to happen is that agent needs to exercise the judgment in order to understand what is the context of the user and what part of this context graph can I actually communicate?
Yes, 100%.
In order to actually answer.
Yeah, I like to draw the analogy of like in the old world it was user into web app into database, and now it's actually like user into agent into database. There's a whole can of worms there. Like the agent, if you just treat it like a service account, it can do anything, right? It actually has access to everything.
Yeah. So, I think like a good analogy to this is if I were talking to my manager and I asked my manager, hey, should I discount this deal by 40%? The context that my manager will use in order to answer that question might be a conversation that is protected that they had with their CEO. That is context that maybe me as an SDR, right, may not actually be privy to, and maybe I don't have the privilege or the access, right, to actually understand or know what that conversation was. Yeah. But the answer that the manager gave me kind of recalled a piece of context that is privileged that I don't have access to. And so this is actually where like the nuance of judgment, right, like I think really needs to come from. Yeah. And the way that we've gone about solving this, and I think it's useful to actually take a position here and then like start refining it. The way we've actually gone about addressing this is we've said, okay, a context graph actually represents a bunch of different archetypes or a bunch of different types of records across different systems of record. The records themselves are governed objects, and those governed objects are owned by different people, right, in the organization. Let's make sure that the kind of sub-slice of the context graph that an agent has access to is filtered by the permissions that the end user actually has, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So essentially, you can operate over the entire graph, but you can actually attribute answers back down to specific governed objects, and then if that check who has access to this governed object or not, and then actually influence your answer that way. It's actually been like a really simple but effective way of managing security at these enterprise scales, but without losing the benefit of co-representing all of this context in some sort of central way.
100%. Actually, internally, we've been talking about this quite a bit within our team, and we started talking about this in the context of just IAMs. Like our traditional IAMs with resources like ARNs and the associated roles that are allowed to access this resource. Is that enough? And I think we're arriving at a similar conclusion that you are. It's enough for this very coarse-grained control, but for something as nuanced that's like, hey, maybe I had a conversation with my manager and there's information there, but then I'm only allowed to give almost like a synthesized view of that information to people downstream, right? That part of it isn't really quite captured. It's almost just like internally we've been calling it vibe off. I think that's going to be a better way. I don't think the words vibe and go together, right? But there's almost this like layer where you want to enable agentic or AI based synthesis of the data. And actually, if you think about it, it's in database terms, it's kind of like a view of the data, right? Can you apply a view? Maybe it's a prompt, a view of the data that then makes it safe for access for certain, call it, I think you use the word kind of like subsets of the context graph. Which is a super interesting problem because I think really back in the day, everything here was built for the structured world, right? Very easy to draw kind of like subsets of tables. But what happens when the data you work with is unstructured, right?
Exactly. I mean, like most of these problems actually come from the unstructured world. It's not clear always, right? Like what is the governance around every single artifact? And I think beyond that, like if you were to look at my Google Drive, for example, everything is in a single folder. Like it's that's why it gets hairy, right? Well, let's talk about context graphs. I mean, I think we like kind of introduced the term.
Let's do it. I think we kind of like talked a little bit about it. Maybe I'm sure there's people listening to the pod and they're still not as familiar as to what a context graph would mean. But you want to maybe give folks like a 1-minute primer first?
So you're asking me to define a context graph. That's the magic is that actually saying what it's not. So context graphs was kind of a series of articles that Jaya and I wrote late December. And what it was really trying to do was respond to this feeling that I think most enterprise adopters of AI, I think universally felt, which was 2025 was supposed to be the year of agents, and it just didn't deliver. And I think there was this like universal question of like, why didn't they deliver? And what is the gap? And I think a lot of people were talking about, I think in abstract terms, what the gap was. But I think the reason why context graphs were important and I think why they went as viral as they did is because for the first time, someone put a finger on, what was that gap and how to actually, build it. And I think that's actually what Jay and I actually often talk about. That is like, why did it hit so hard? And I think that was why. Now, what context graphs are specifically, right, is a kind of internal and shared representation of how decisions are represented, as opposed to just the outcomes. Traditionally, when we think about systems of record, they live in the read path. And so what they do is they store the outcome of certain decisions that are made across teams. A good example of this is, this sale closed and it's worth this much, or this incident was resolved by this person by doing this. But a lot of the reasoning, a lot of the why and how did we get here ends up naturally being lost. And if you think about the context that's really required for agents to go from good to great, the gap is in agents understanding why decisions are made. And so this context graph thing actually really introduces this idea of the decision trace, where you could actually trace through decisions. And as agents start owning more and more of the authority to actually work from end to end, you can actually start capturing what we call these decision traces. And if you store them and you collect them and you learn from them in a meaningful way, you can actually have a set of agents that actually get better over time, right? They can capture kind of the institutional why and become more effective for the enterprise over time. And this is heavily informed by a lot of how we've architected PlayerZero, especially in kind of the production engineering workflows. But I think if you even outside of PlayerZero, look at a lot of companies that have done a great job of, doing great agentic deployments. And I think there's actually a small minority of companies that have really delivered on this side.
Yeah, 100%.
That often actually tends to be the missing layer.
Yeah, let me know what you think too, because I started hearing this word a lot, training, but now applied to agents instead of models, maybe towards the end of last year. And I've never heard that before. Like I've worked in ML and AI for a while, but training is always applied to models, right? People are now talking about training agents, and the layman's understanding of that is, as the agents, you use the agent, you kind of give it feedback, like, hey, like don't do this, like here's a corner case, like and really that feeds back, I think, in the simplest form as amending the prompt, right? The system prompt, or giving it better context. But I think one thing that you said that really resonates is almost this idea of like, can I have an agent that's built for me, right? That's built on my context graph and that's trained to work specifically for me. And really, I feel like that part of it resonates quite a bit. And you really can't get an agent that's trained for you unless it's able to access all this, all these decision traces that it's kind of accumulated over time, whether by itself or through browsing, I don't know, meeting notes or something. Like that seems a lot harder and less tractable.
Yeah. Well, it's a really elegant loop, right? Like as these agents are actually, doing more work, they end up producing more, decision traces, and those decision traces end up kind of back into the process. I guess.
Yeah, I'm curious here actually.
Agents.
You mentioned that this is implemented at PlayerZero.
Yeah.
Was there any point in time where you all decided that this was the approach, and did you all see big shifts in product capability, metrics, and maybe give folks an idea of was there a world before you all decided to start building out your own internal representations of decision traces, and after?
Yeah. Well, actually, this actually folds into the question that you had earlier about how to train agents as well. There's two things that people usually mean, or I think there's two factions of what it means to actually train agents. One is, you internalize the learning. So what that fundamentally means is you have to update model weights. And the way you usually do that is you have trajectories that are labeled good and bad. And then after that, then you use, SFT or, RFT or some version of this to update model weights to follow more closely the trajectories that you think you want to reward. I think people found that this was a very difficult thing to do because the labeling problem is very difficult.
Yes.
In enterprise, there is no verifiable reward 100% of the time. On the other side, I think there's a lot of other things you can do that give you a ton of lift, but do it very cheaply, which is to externalize the learning. And to externalize the learning, I think this is where, in an old world where a lot of us were thinking about how to do RAG better, right? Or how do you optimize the prompts better? I think you very quickly kind of reach some sort of a ceiling on this. And there needs to be a more fundamental way to externalize how different pieces of context that you kind of, operate over in order to make a particular decision can actually be represented together. I think a great example of this is our brains are really good at doing this, by the way, this feeling of I've been here before, and, this, I don't know, I'll give an incident, specific analogy here, because this is what we spend our time kind of thinking about. But imagine a senior engineer that's been around your company for the last decade, and they've seen every single way that your software could possibly go sideways. And they see a support ticket and someone's saying hey, you know what? I've been trying to upload this invoice and it's not working. And the moment they read it, they have a flashback, right, to 3 years ago. And they're okay, well, actually when this happens, I need to go check basically the load on this server, right? And then they go, to Datadog, and they go look at that server, and they're yeah, weirdly the CPU is 98%, right? It's okay, that doesn't look great, right? What did we change recently? Right. And it's oh man, yeah, we actually made this particular update, and, we changed the way that we index and whatever else. Right. And so they actually start pulling a thread, and with that thread, a bunch of content essentially ends up kind of coming up with it. The transition for us from traditional RAG to, a year later, what ended up becoming called context graphs was us basically trying to build a system that could represent that fabric, right? So as you start pulling a thread and you say, hey, I'm specifically interested in what makes invoice processing go down. And then you want to start pulling in, other types of context about, hey, I should take a look at this service, or I should really take a look at this, I don't know, this change that happened recently, or whatever it might be. Figuring out ways to really co-represent that, so that way the next time we see the same thing again, you can essentially recreate that sense of deja vu for the
agent deja vu. Yeah.
That's
then it's very tightly related with any sort of agentic memory. And there's a whole bunch of companies out there that try to do agentic memory. How do you think about context graphs versus agent memory discussion? I mean, one thing I can think of is definitely, this context graph is now shared across multiple different agents rather than being specifically for a single agent. But yeah, do you see there being a big distinction here?
Yeah. I personally do. So the I think memories are important. Like they make a difference. I think they're slightly over-engineered in the current conversation.
Yeah,
It's like really nothing more than just like create a document, stick it in a vector database, and like
put it in like Cloud MD or something. Yeah, 100%.
yeah, like RMD. Like it's cool, but like it clearly doesn't scale all that well. Context graphs, to overload the term a little bit, is like a question of how to represent an institutional memory, not a fact. And I think that's where the distinction actually lies, right? Like I think memory systems, as we traditionally talk about them today, is how do I memorize facts that are important for a particular, decision or something like that. But this is an institutional memory of like how and why are decisions actually made. And so it's like much bigger than anything you could write in a single document. It's my sense is actually more of a representation learning question. So it's a question of like, today we think about recall as a semantic thing, but I think there's like a structural element to this. Say, what are the hooks to recall that actually relate to the agent trajectory? So I think there's like a different framing of this problem. I haven't fully formalized this yet in like terms of how to talk about this publicly, but I think there's a lot of I think that's the direction that we're thinking in, at least, right? Like there's it can't be a vector database where there's just a bunch of documents. Like it's just not gonna work.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I actually have been thinking a lot about this as well. My crazy idea that I presented, I think 2 weeks ago at SF AI engineer meetup was, hey, like, what if instead of storing your documents in a database, you just put it all in context? Just have a bunch of agents sitting around, just like all the documents, everything is just in context. Your trajectories is just all in context, and just treat your agents like a database, right? I really liked the word you used there. That this feels to me also that it's a representation problem. It's like, how do you represent that data, that context in an effective way? And maybe the way to represent it is as the cache, like KV cache context in an agent, and that's the way that like that's supposed to be. I don't know. Well, I just kind of how this, right? Like that 10-year-old engineer has everything kind of in context in his brain. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think actually a good version of this is you can think about how ChatGPT implemented memories. I don't know. Have you come across that article? There's like some dude who's
right. If I'm not wrong, I could be wrong though. I think
it's literally what you said. Like they take the last like X number of conversations, and then they have like a very condensed representation of it.
Okay.
They literally just inject into the prompt, and so there's no recall. Like it's quite literal. Yeah, it's like compaction across the last 20 conversations. They're like, hey, this is what you talked about. And that's it. That's all. So yeah. I like fundamentally believe memories are like a different problem. And actually going back to this funny comment I made earlier, which is like context graphs went viral. I think the primary reason they went viral was because like we took a position on like why, like what the gap was. I think the other reason it went viral is because everybody thought they were already building it.
Yeah.
And so
everyone came out with the woodwork. I feel like they were like, here's my take on it. It was crazy. It's so funny.
That was hilarious, man. But honestly, I think I've actually really appreciated the conversation. Like it's been great to see like how different people are approaching the problem. At the end of the day, like we're still in the first innings of what AI is really going to be in the next decade. I don't think we've like scratched the surface yet. So yeah, it's just like whatever helps everyone learn faster. I think this is a very, very positive thing.
Yeah, 100%. All right, take us home. Round it all up. Any I like to ask people, since we're at the start of 2026, what do you think will happen at the end of 2026? And then we can do a retrospective at the end. Any kind of, maybe not a hot take, but just like a prediction. Like, what do you think are maybe the biggest things to move, specifically within data AI, the space that we operate in 2026?
Yeah, I think I'll give you one like lukewarm take, and then I'll give you one hot take. I think the lukewarm take is that actually like this is going to be the year that AI adoption in enterprise actually happens. I think it's going to be a year delayed. Everyone thought it was going to happen last year, but I think it's going to happen this year. And I think it's because the intelligence of these agents has passed some critical threshold where I think the agent is smarter than the average, the average human. And I think that's a really good thing. Now, I think
I think it's more than
100%. It 100% is like, Opus 4.5 is like the smartest. It's amazing. But like now that it's kind of past this like critical threshold, a lot of the infrastructure, the product, the UX, like these things are now starting to mature to the degree where enterprises can really adopt them and start seeing real leverage. And so I think a lot of these like economic effects of AI, I think we're going to start seeing over the course of this year. So that's kind of the lukewarm take. I think a lot of people would agree with me. I think the other one is, I think this is also the year where we go and figure out how to do continual learning. And continual learning, I don't think is actually going to look like constantly updating model weights. I think it's actually going to be an externalized form of learning that's going to look, some implementation of context graphs are actually verticalized. So I don't think there is like a universal context graph layer or anything like that. I think there's a lot of leverage to doing this in some sort of verticalized fashion. And so I think there's going to be different implementations of this depending on what vertical you're working on. This is the year of continual learning, but I don't think continual learning
one lukewarm take and one hot take. Yeah. No, I was nodding so hard to continual learning one because I think I worked in like ML ops for a long time. And then I think at the end of it, like after the whole hype cycle died down with the AI stuff coming out, I just realized that, hey, nobody wants to train. Nobody wants to update these models. Like, what a thing. It's so bad. It's so painful. Like an enterprise company never wants to do this, right?
Yep.
At the end of the day, they just want better model. And if there's a way to get there without having to retrain and using GPUs, like they're going to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Animesh, this was such a pleasure. Super fun. I hope we get you back again at the end of 2026 and we can see where we all land with everything. But yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Zero Shot Espresso. If you liked the episode, share it with another engineer who spends way too much time thinking about data systems in the age of AI. See you next time.